So if you're looking at getting into PC gaming, you've got a few different options. You could buy a gaming laptop, which can get kind of expensive and you won't be able to upgrade it in the future. You can also build your own PC, which is really cool, but that's getting kind of expensive too these days. So there's one other option though that people tend to overlook, and that's getting a budget gaming desktop. And we've got one here that we're going to look at, the Dell Inspiron 5680 gaming desktop. And I think it makes a pretty compelling case for a good way to get into PC gaming on a budget. Dell has two versions of the Inspiron gaming desktop, the 5675, which is powered by AMD, and the 5680, which is powered by Intel and Nvidia. Outside of the different configuration options and components, the exterior of the tower looks pretty much identical. It's a design I really like, especially at this price point. It's less audacious than a more gaming-focused brand like Alienware or Republic of Gamers, but it doesn't at all look or feel cheap. The blue lighting through the side vents also gives a splash of interest, and you can even get it installed with a clear side panel if you want a better view of the internals. Speaking of your components, what we got with our build was the Core i7-8700 processor and the GTX 1060 to power the graphics. The 1060 isn't the most high-end graphics component, obviously, but for the price of this system, which is just $1,100, it's a really good deal. If you want an even better deal, go for the $800 configuration, which will get you that same GTX 1060, except with a slower processor and no SSD. You can go even cheaper down to $600, which is the base level, and that'll get you the GTX 1050. Like the exterior design, not much has changed on the inside of the Inspiron 5680 either. Removing a couple of screws opens access to the interior really easily. Because of its relatively small size, the components on the inside are a bit cramped, though not as squished as some other budget desktops we've seen. You have a pretty clear view of your RAM and your expansion slots, so most upgrades or additions won't require taking out other components to get inside. The graphics card is the biggest obstacle. It's bracketed down to hold it in place, which prevents damage to the PCIe slot in shipping. That means you'll have to remove the bracket to swap the GPU out, and in certain circumstances, the added bulk might conflict with another upgrade. Outside of that, the primary stumbling block towards upgrading your GPU in the future is going to be your power. This tower comes with a 460 watt power supply, nicely tucked into the bottom corner of the chassis out of the way, though it's probably not going to be enough to power something like a GTX 1070 or 1080 if you want to do that in the future. The CPU performance is obviously great, which is what you'd expect from an 8th gen i7, but this is a gaming desktop, so let's get into how well this thing can actually play games. In something like Fortnight, you'll have a blast turning up the settings to epic, even in a higher resolution like 1440p, which is what we're doing here. We've got it running here on those settings, and as you can see, we're getting pretty stable frame rates of around 50 frames per second. To play a game like Fortnite, you really want to have that ability to react accurately and quickly, and the Inspiron handles it really well. If you need a full 100 frames per second, we got that easily covered by moving the graphics settings down a notch to high. For something a little more intensive, we gave Battlefield 1 a spin and also saw some really impressive results. At 1440p again, it spit out a very solid 59 frames per second on Ultra and 87 frames per second when we moved it down to medium. Obviously, this is all going to get better when you move everything down to 1080p with those same settings. We did manage to stump the system though, with the benchmark in Deus Ex Mankind Divided in 1440p with the settings maxed. So obviously there are limitations to the GTX 1060, but for most modern games and especially more casual games, you're going to get really smooth frame rates even at higher settings. Dell also claims that this desktop is VR ready, and in our test in VRmark, it actually performed really well, and so this is going to be ready to work with an Oculus Rift headset or an HTC Vive headset pretty well in most apps and games. The one big area where Dell's had to make a compromise here is in storage options. All the different configurations you get come with a 1 terabyte hard disk drive, and while that's a lot of space, it is pretty slow. The higher end configurations do come with a solid state drive, but they are over the SATA connection, which is a little bit slower than PCIe, and you only get 128 gigabytes maxed out. Also, you'll have to pay an extra $50 if you want a USB-C port, which also comes with an old school optical drive if you're into that sort of thing. There will always be compromises with a gaming PC at this price, and it's pretty clear where Dell cut corners on this one. However, if you want the best gaming performance in the cheapest form possible, I really think the Dell Inspiron 5680 is a really good place to start.